When Éché Goukouni fled Chad, she believed geography would do what family and tradition had not. With her young son, she crossed borders and began again, far from the man she feared. For the first time since her wedding, Éché was free to imagine a better future. Then came the consequences. To understand how this tragedy unfolded, we must first understand Chad itself. Chad is a landlocked country at the crossroads of North and Central Africa, roughly twice the size of Texas. It is among the poorest nations on Earth, a place where daily life is often a struggle for basic needs. Since 1990, Chad has been ruled by one family. President Idriss Déby seized power in a coup and held it with an iron grip for over 3 decades until his death in 2021. His son took the helm immediately thereafter, extending the family's rule. In Chad, political connections can determine everything. Laws and courts often bend to the will of the powerful. It's a system where who you know may matter more than what you've done. For women, the situation is especially grim. Chad has one of the highest rates of forced and underage marriage in the world. By some estimates, nearly 2/3 of Chadian girls are married off before their 18th birthday. Laws against domestic violence exist on paper, but enforcement is rare and often ineffectual. Tradition and social pressures keep many abuse victims silent. When a woman tries to escape an abusive husband, she risks not only shame and ostracism, but very real physical danger. This is the world in which Éché Goukouni found herself trapped. Éché was a young woman from N'Djamena, the bustling capital of Chad. Like many in her community, she came from a family that upheld tradition, yet cared deeply for one another. In 2016, when Éché was still barely more than a teenager, her life took a drastic turn. That year, under immense family and social pressure, she was married off to a man named Ali Koré Mahamat. He was a distant relative by marriage, a Franco-Chadian dual national who served as an officer in the Chadian military. The wedding was formalized at the French embassy in N'Djamena, a bureaucratic stamp that would later prove significant. But for Éché, it was not a day of joy. She later testified that she never truly consented to the marriage. Surrounded by relatives and officials, she felt she had no choice. Almost immediately, Ali's true nature emerged behind closed doors. He was volatile, controlling, and violent. As an army man, Ali was used to command and obedience. At home, he treated Éché not as a partner, but as property. The abuse was physical and psychological. Éché would recall being slapped and beaten for the smallest perceived slights. When she resisted his advances or voiced the slightest dissent, Ali's temper flared dangerously. By her account, he forced himself on her, turning what should have been intimacy into a horror. The young bride lived in constant fear of her husband's mood swings. Family and neighbors might have suspected she was unhappy, but in Chad, a wife's suffering is often kept hidden behind compound walls. In 2017, Éché gave birth to a baby boy, we'll call him Lucas, to protect his identity. Becoming a mother gave Éché a new resolve. She now had someone else to protect, an innocent life dependent on her. But motherhood also tied her more tightly to her abusive husband. Ali doted on the son in his own way, but it didn't temper his cruelty toward Éché. If anything, his sense of ownership deepened. She was the mother of his child, and therefore, in his eyes, doubly bound to him. For Éché, the stakes were rising. She feared not only for her own life, but for her little boy growing up in such violence. The breaking point came after roughly 2 years of torment. By late 2018, Éché could no longer see a future for herself if she stayed. She later said she believed that if she continued living with Ali, he would eventually kill her. In October 2018, with her infant in her arms, Éché made a desperate choice. She ran. Quietly and with great caution, She reached out to the one person she hoped would help, her father, Éché Goukouni. Idris was a man caught between tradition and love for his child. He had been part of arranging Éché's marriage to Ali, likely thinking it would secure her future. Ali came from an influential family and held French citizenship. To many, he might have seemed a desirable match. But by 2018, Idris knew the truth of his daughter's suffering. When Éché pleaded for help, he did something uncommon in their society. He supported her escape. In helping Éché flee her husband, Idris was defying deeply ingrained customs that frowned upon a wife leaving her marital home. He was also, as events would show, putting himself and others at risk. But a father's duty to protect won out. A plan was set. Éché would go to France with her baby, far beyond Ali's reach. In the dead of night, Éché slipped away with her son. By late October 2018, she arrived in France and claimed asylum. She found refuge in the city of Orléans, a provincial capital south of Paris. France was an alien environment to her, colder, calmer, and utterly different from the dusty streets of N'Djamena. But for Éché, it meant one crucial thing: safety. She was far from Ali. The long arm of an abusive husband, she hoped, could not reach into a foreign land protected by the rule of law. For the first time in years, Éché could sleep without fear of a midnight beating. For the first time, she could imagine raising her son in peace. In Chad, however, the aftermath of her escape was anything but peaceful. News of Éché's disappearance must have reached Ali swiftly, and when he learned that not only had his wife fled, but that her own family had a hand in it, his pride and honor were shattered. In his eyes, his in-laws had committed an unpardonable offense. They had taken what he saw as rightfully his. Friends and relatives would later say that Ali was enraged beyond reason. He publicly accused his father-in-law of whisking Éché and the baby off to France. It was as though Ali believed Éché could not have left of her own accord. Someone must have made her leave, and he held her family responsible. In the patriarchal culture Ali inhabited, a wife's defiance was an affront that could easily tip into violence. He stewed on this humiliation for weeks as October turned to November. Éché, his possession, as he viewed it, was out of his control. Moreover, she was in France, a Western country, beyond his immediate grasp. This fact gnawed at him. He demanded through messages and relatives that Éché return to Chad with their son. Of course, she did not. Each day she remained abroad was another day Ali's anger mounted. He wanted someone to blame and punish. On November 27, 2018, Ali decided to take matters into his own hands. That day, the Goukouni family compound in N'Djamena was bustling with life as usual. The compound was in Farsha, a neighborhood in the city's 4th arrondissement, a mix of modest homes and walled family enclaves. Late that afternoon, an unexpected visitor pushed through the gates. It was Ali. He was dressed in civilian clothes, but everyone knew his background as a soldier. He was visibly agitated, eyes blazing with a volatile mix of rage and desperation. Inside the courtyard, the family quickly gathered in alarm. Éché's father came out to see his son-in-law. Éché's mother hovered nearby, and among the others present was Éché's younger brother, 19-year-old Ousmane Goukouni. Ousmane was barely an adult, a gentle youth by all accounts, with his whole life ahead of him. Ali wasted no time with pleasantries. He was there on a mission fueled by wrath. He confronted his father-in-law, demanding that his wife be returned to him at once. It wasn't a request, it was a threat. Idris, a man in his 50s, tried to reason with him. But Ali was past listening. Suddenly, Ali's hand went to his waistband and emerged gripping a pistol. Family members screamed for him to stop. A neighbor shouted an alarm from beyond the wall. But before anyone could intervene, Ali opened fire. The first shot hit Ousmane in the chest. The 19-year-old crumpled to the ground, blood soaking through his shirt. His mother's scream pierced the late afternoon. Idris lunged toward his fallen son, just as a second shot rang out. This bullet tore into Idris's leg, shattering bone. He collapsed onto the sand beside Ousmane, writhing in pain. More shots followed, ricocheting off a wall, splintering a wooden post. People scattered, ducking for cover. Other family members sobbed and shouted for help, and at the center of it all stood Ali, pistol in hand, his face twisted in unbridled rage and a kind of grim satisfaction. The deed was done. He had punished those he blamed. What happened next was a blur of action. Neighbors who heard the gunfire rushed to the compound gate, and at least one had the presence of mind to alert the authorities immediately. In the capital, the sound of live gunfire in a residential area draws swift attention. Years of civil strife and security crackdowns have made people vigilant. Within minutes, armed security forces arrived on the scene, a mix of local police and gendarmes. Remarkably, the shooter did not flee. Ali stood amid the carnage he had wrought, as if rooted to the spot. The responding officers, however, treated the situation with the gravity it demanded. They ordered Ali to drop his weapon. For a tense moment, he hesitated. Then he tossed the pistol to the ground. The same man who had swaggered in full of fury was quickly surrounded and disarmed. The security forces apprehended Ali on the spot, pinning his arms and securing him in handcuffs. He did not resist arrest. The fight, it seemed, had gone out of him now that blood had been spilled. Medics arrived and attended to Idris, stabilizing the injured father's leg and rushing him to a hospital. They could do nothing for his son. Usman was pronounced dead at the scene, a life cut short over one man's twisted sense of vengeance. His body was gently covered and later taken away for burial preparations. Word of the killing spread rapidly through the city. A family dispute had escalated into a double shooting. Such events are not unheard of in Chad, but this case had particularly unsettling undertones. It stemmed from a forced marriage and a woman's bid for freedom, matters that touched on deep societal issues. Ali was taken into custody that night. He was escorted to Amsinene prison in N'Djamena, a detention facility where many criminal suspects await trial. The gravity of his act, a murder and an attempted murder, meant there was little question he would be held without bail. In France, Éché received the devastating news over the phone. In a single moment, everything she had feared might happen had indeed come to pass, but to those she loved most. Éché herself, though safe in body, suddenly found her soul crushed under the weight of loss and blame. Back in N'Djamena, the investigation into the shooting was, in many ways, straightforward. The perpetrator had been caught literally red-handed at the scene. There was no mystery about who pulled the trigger or why. Witnesses had heard Ali's furious demands that Éché be brought back. As the case made its way into the formal justice system, Ali was charged with murder and assault. Under Chadian law, if a homicide is deemed premeditated, it can warrant the death penalty. If considered a crime of passion or non-premeditated murder, it still carries decades in prison, even life. The distinction would become important later, but at the moment, everyone understood that Ali's act was deliberate and ferocious, even if it occurred in the heat of a confrontation. Many sympathized with the Goukouni family. Sending Éché away had been an act of protection and love, and now they were paying a cruel price. Others, steeped in conservative views, sadly muttered that Éché's disobedience had invited disaster. But virtually everyone agreed on one thing. Ali had committed a grievous wrong. While the evidence of guilt was clear, a subtle tension underlay the case as it progressed toward trial. Ali was not an ordinary citizen. Besides being a member of the military, he hailed from a family with powerful ties. Gossip in the capital linked him to a prominent figure, his uncle, Muhammad Ahmad Choukou. Choukou was a well-known politician, a stalwart of the ruling party, and had even served as president of Chad's constitutional court in years past. This connection was common knowledge among the Chadian elite, and it soon reached the ears of journalists and bloggers. In June 2019, about half a year after the murder, a fiery Chadian dissident blogger named Makaila Ngwebla published a startling allegation from his exile in France. Citing sources close to the judiciary, Makaila claimed that Ali's influential uncle was attempting to pull strings behind the scenes. According to the blog, Muhammad Ahmad Choukou had offered a hefty bribe to the judge overseeing Ali's case, hoping to have the charges dropped or at least downgraded. The Chadian public, especially those active on social media, reacted with a mix of outrage and weary cynicism to these claims. Many had seen similar scenarios play out before, the rich and powerful protecting their own. Was this going to be yet another case where a killer walks free because of who he knows? The prospect of Ali escaping punishment infuriated ordinary citizens who wanted justice for the Goukouni family. However, few were surprised. "Welcome to Chad," one commentator wrote bitterly online, "where if you have a general or a minister in your family, prison is optional." Still, the very fact that the allegation was public, exposed by diaspora media, put pressure on the system. The judge and authorities in N'Djamena knew that people were watching. Despite whatever maneuvers may have been attempted in smoky backrooms, in the end the case was not dropped. The evidence was too public, the crime too egregious to simply sweep under the rug. Idris, once he recovered from his leg wound, made it clear that he would not be cowed into silence or accepting a payoff. His son was dead, and he wanted his day in court. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in France, Éché was also taking action. Though grieving and traumatized, Éché's resolve had hardened. She was alive, and she had her child to protect. But she would not forget what had been done to her family. In March 2019, barely 4 months after the murder, Éché filed a formal criminal complaint in France against her estranged husband, Ali. This was an unusual and bold step. Ali was a French citizen, and under French law, a French national can be prosecuted in France for certain serious crimes committed abroad, including murder, under the principle of active nationality jurisdiction. By lodging this complaint, Éché was asking French authorities to investigate and charge Ali with murder as well. It was a way to hedge against the uncertainty of the Chadian process. If Chad's justice faltered, perhaps France's would not. At the same time, Éché moved to sever the remaining legal ties between herself and the man who had caused such destruction. In late May 2019, through the French courts in Orléans, she petitioned to annul her 2016 marriage to Ali. The grounds were clear: lack of consent. She asserted that the marriage had been forced upon her, and therefore it should be rendered null and void under French law. It was a deeply symbolic move for Éché. This was not just a bureaucratic formality, it was her statement of liberation, a repudiation of the coercion that had derailed her life. These French proceedings ran their course over the following months and years. By December 2020, Éché won a significant victory. The tribunal in Orléans annulled the marriage. The French judges recognized that she had never freely consented to wed Ali. With a stroke of a pen, the union was erased as if it had never been. However, the criminal complaint Éché filed in France did not see swift progress. French investigators did open a case and even sent a request to Chad for cooperation in gathering evidence. But international justice moved slowly and, in this instance, met with silence from N'Djamena. Chad's authorities showed little appetite for engaging with a foreign inquiry into a crime that their own courts were already handling. Still, Éché's complaint remained on file, a potential avenue for justice down the road. And as events in Chad would later show, that avenue might prove crucial. Back in Chad, Ali's trial was delayed, likely by procedural formalities and by the quiet tug-of-war of influence behind the scenes. Nearly 2.5 years passed since the day of the shooting. If he harbored any hope that his connections would spring him loose, they did not materialize before the trial. The spotlight on the case, fueled by diaspora commentary and the gravity of the crime, may have forced the authorities to carry through. Finally, in late May 2021, the trial of Ali Koré Mahamat commenced in N'Djamena. It was convened before a special criminal chamber of the Court of Appeal, which in Chad often handles major crimes in the first instance. The proceedings were not widely publicized in state media, perhaps to avoid unwanted attention, but word filtered out via independent press and those in the courtroom. Éché could not be there in person. She remained in France, following updates through her lawyers and family. But in spirit she was present, as the case hinged on the injustice done to her and her kin. Observers noted that Ali had lost weight in detention. The once brash soldier appeared sullen and subdued. Over several days the court reviewed the evidence. Witnesses were called to testify about what happened on November 27, 2018, and what had led to it. After deliberation, the court rendered its verdict on June 1st, 2021. Ali Corey Muhammad was found guilty on all counts. With the conviction came a heavy sentence, 30 years of imprisonment at hard labor. In the context of Chadian justice, a 30-year sentence is a very severe punishment, one step below life imprisonment, which itself is relatively rare. Such a term reflected the court's view of the gravity of his crimes. Though nothing could bring Usman back or fully heal Idris's wounds, at least the man responsible was to be locked away, paying for what he had done. In a sense, one chapter of this tragedy had closed. However, Chad's turmoil had more in store. Just a month prior to the trial, in April 2021, President Idris Deby, the autocratic ruler whose reign had framed all of Éché's life, was killed on the battlefield while fighting a rebel incursion. His death sent shockwaves through the country. Deby's sudden demise led to the formation of a transitional military government headed by his son, Mahamat Deby. Amid this upheaval, the fact that Ali's trial still went ahead in June was a positive sign. The judiciary maintained course even as power changed hands at the top. After the conviction, the Chadian authorities made a decision that, at the time, seemed prudent. Given the heinous nature of Ali's crime and its high-profile status, they decided not to keep him in an ordinary prison in the capital. Instead, Ali was transferred to the notorious Koro Toro prison in mid-2021. Koro Toro is a name that inspires dread in Chad. Located in the remote Borku Desert, some 600 kilometers, about 370 miles, north of N'Djamena, it's often described as the country's most secure and isolated penitentiary. The facility sits amid endless dunes, far from any population center, a windswept fortress where Chad holds its most dangerous criminals and political prisoners. In Koro Toro, there would be no chance of escape, no reachable allies, and no easy comforts. For the Goukounis and others concerned with justice, this transfer was reassuring. Ali would serve his time in a place from which escape was virtually inconceivable. At least that was the assumption. For about a year, all was quiet. Ali vanished from the public eye, locked away in a sweltering cell under the desert sun. Éché tried to rebuild her life as best she could in France. In Orléans, she began to study and work, raising little Lucas, who by now was a toddler. She was not alone. During this period, she found companionship and support from someone who understood her fight. In 2021, Éché grew close to a French investigative journalist named Thomas Dietrich. Thomas had a deep interest in Chad and had reported on the country's politics and human rights issues. In time, that professional concern turned personal. He and Éché fell in love and became partners. Thomas, with his contacts and experience, became an ardent advocate for Éché's cause. He encouraged her to keep seeking justice and used his platform to bring attention to what had happened to her family. Thomas Dietrich was no stranger to the shadowy side of Chadian politics. He had clashed with the Deby regime before, openly criticizing their corruption and abuses in articles and social media. In September 2021, Thomas published a particularly explosive piece that had nothing to do with Éché's case, but everything to do with the environment that allowed someone like Ali to think he could act with impunity. Thomas exposed how a former Chadian intelligence chief, a man accused of torture and repression named Mahamat Ismail Chaibo, was living comfortably in France, despite his notorious past. The article, published in a French outlet, embarrassed powerful figures in Chad. It showed that even as the transitional government talked of reform, known human rights violators from the old regime were seemingly untouchable, sometimes right on French soil. The reaction to Thomas's reporting was swift and ominous. Shortly after the piece came out, members of Éché's family back in N'Djamena began receiving threatening messages. Unidentified individuals, the implication was they were connected to security circles, delivered a warning. If Thomas didn't stop digging and publishing stories that shamed Chadian authorities, there would be consequences. And the threat they levied was as specific as it was terrifying. They insinuated that the imprisoned murderer, Ali, could somehow return if Thomas continued to cause problems. The message was clear. The regime, or elements within it, was willing to weaponize even a convicted killer to silence a critic. Éché's case and Ali himself had become entangled in a much larger struggle. When Thomas and Éché learned of these threats, they took them seriously. This was not mere bluster. They knew the way Chad's power networks operated. Thomas attempted to use official channels to counter any possible plot. In May 2021, just before Ali's trial, he had personally reached out to Chad's Justice Minister, Muhammad Ahmad al-Harbo, alerting him to rumors that Ali's influential uncle might be trying to manipulate the outcome. The minister responded reassuringly. "You can count on me," he told Thomas. Indeed, the trial proceeded and delivered a conviction, suggesting that at least at that point, justice had held firm. But now, as 2022 approached, Thomas and Éché had fresh cause for alarm. After the threats in late 2021, Thomas sent follow-up inquiries to contacts in Chad's government. He wanted assurances that Ali would remain securely behind bars. This time, however, no reply came. Unbeknownst to them, events were already in motion in that distant desert prison. In the first half of 2022, whispers began filtering through the grapevine in N'Djamena. Something was amiss at Koro Toro. By late May, just around the time Thomas published another hard-hitting article, rumors reached him that Ali was no longer in custody. It sounded unbelievable at first, almost the stuff of conspiracy theories. How could a man escape from Koro Toro, the most remote and well-guarded prison in the country? And if he had, why were the authorities silent? There were no public announcements of an escape, no manhunt, nothing on state radio or in the press. The official stance was complete silence. But behind closed doors, the French embassy in N'Djamena quietly confirmed the unsettling truth. Ali had escaped. The confirmation came in a document dated September 29, 2022, an attestation from the French embassy's security attaché. It stated plainly that the assassin escaped from Koro Toro prison and was believed to be back in N'Djamena. This internal memo was not meant for the public, but it found its way into the hands of investigative journalists months later. For those in the know, it only affirmed what they suspected. Ali had indeed vanished from custody. The implausible had occurred. The immediate question was, how? How does a convicted murderer get out of Chad's most fortified jail, a place literally surrounded by hundreds of miles of desert? The unofficial answers were obvious, if deeply troubling. One cannot escape Koro Toro without accomplices, observers noted bluntly. The escape had to have been an inside job, guards paid off or ordered to turn a blind eye, perhaps a convenient transfer or a feigned medical emergency that allowed an exit. There were even whispers that a helicopter had been involved, though those remained unverified and perhaps fanciful. Regardless of the method, the consensus was that someone with power and influence had orchestrated Ali's illicit liberation. Chadian authorities, for their part, behaved as if nothing had happened. There was no public wanted notice for Ali, no police bulletin. It was as though the system preferred to pretend that the man they had sentenced to 30 years simply did not exist anymore. When news of the escape reached Éché and Thomas, they were aghast. It is hard to overstate the nightmare this development posed for Éché. The man who had terrorized her, killed her brother, and vowed vengeance was free, and he had escaped under suspicious circumstances that suggested protection from on high. All of Éché's old fears roared back to life. She was still living in France, far from Chad, but now even France didn't feel far enough. Ali had dual nationality and presumably still possessed a French passport or the means to obtain one. If he could slip out of prison, what would stop him from boarding a plane to Paris? He had contacts, resources, and a seething vendetta. From her undisclosed location in France, Éché told a journalist that she now lived in constant fear that Ali would find a way to reach her. "I live in fear that the killer will come to France and attack my son, or me, or Thomas," she confided. He swore he would finish the job. According to Éché, Ali had explicitly threatened in the past to kill her if she didn't return to him. He had already murdered one family member, and there was every reason to believe he would make good on his dark promise if given the chance. Every time Éché stepped outside, she wondered if he could be lurking somewhere, somehow. French authorities, once informed, shared her alarm. In internal discussions, they acknowledged the risk. One French security official stated plainly, "Our fear is that this individual, currently in Chad, could fly to France and attack his ex-wife, their son, or Thomas Dietrich." The spectre of a convicted murderer potentially travelling to France to commit another atrocity was chilling to law enforcement. The Goukouni family in N'Djamena also remained in peril. They had already endured so much, and now the man who had harmed them was apparently back in their city, possibly emboldened by powerful backers. It was as if a carefully bandaged wound had been violently ripped open. Behind the scenes, French diplomats pressed the Chadian government for answers. France has long maintained significant influence in Chad, its former colony, and the French ambassador made discreet inquiries. Each time Chadian officials stonewalled or offered vague reassurances. The message was clear. This was an internal matter, and no amount of foreign prodding would change the situation. In Paris, Éché's legal team sprang into action once more. They had an existing French case file from the complaint she'd lodged in 2019. Now they had an urgent reason to push it forward. The most immediate step was to secure an international arrest warrant for Ali Kouré Mahamat. Such a warrant, if issued by a French judge, would put Interpol and other international agencies on notice, making it far riskier for Ali to travel abroad and raising pressure on Chad to do something. In November 2022, Éché's lawyers submitted a formal request for an international arrest warrant to the investigating magistrate in charge of the French case. To Éché's astonishment and dismay, the judge refused. The reasons given were bafflingly technical. The judge pointed out that the French case file at that moment did not have official proof of Ali's French nationality. It was an absurd catch-22. Ali had been married at the French embassy, held a French passport, and was widely known to be a dual citizen. Yet because the paperwork from 2007, when he obtained nationality, and 2008, when he got his passport, wasn't in the dossier, the judge hesitated. Moreover, the judge noted that a prior request for cooperation sent to Chad in 2021 had gone unanswered. Without a response, the French investigation hadn't gathered enough evidence directly. Human rights groups and Éché's advocates were flabbergasted by this judicial timidity. It seemed like a case of bureaucracy hampering justice. Even the annulment of the marriage in 2020 by the Orléans court had acknowledged Ali's French citizenship implicitly, yet here was a procedural barrier thrown up over a missing certificate in a file. Undeterred, Éché's side tried again. In January 2024, they made a second appeal for an arrest warrant, hoping the magistrate would relent now that more information was presented. Once again, to their frustration, the judge declined. The magistrate seemed unwilling to move forward aggressively in the absence of cooperation from Chad. It was a stark reminder that legal systems too have their inertia and risk aversion, especially when international politics are in play. So as 2024 began, the situation remained deeply unsettling. Ali was a fugitive convicted killer, living openly, or at least comfortably in Chad, a country apparently unwilling to enforce its own court's verdict against him. France's legal avenues were bogged down in red tape and diplomatic silence, and Éché continued to look over her shoulder in a foreign land, wondering if her past would come for her. There were a few small consolations for Éché during this time. In October 2023, she achieved another legal victory in France. A court in Orléans stripped Ali of all parental authority over their child. The judge, acknowledging the extraordinary circumstances, ruled that a man who murdered the child's uncle and then escaped from prison posed enough of a threat that he should have zero say in the child's life. Back in Chad, the broader context continued to evolve. The transitional government that took over after President Déby's death carried on through 2022 and 2023, promising eventual elections but also cracking down on dissent at times. In a twist of fate, the very blogger who had spoken out about Éché's case, Makaila Ngwebla, returned to Chad in 2022 and was briefly appointed as an advisor on human rights in the new administration. Some thought this indicated a turn for the better, that voices for justice and accountability were being included in governance. However, this hope was short-lived. By February 2024, Makayla was dismissed from his position after openly criticizing the regime's backsliding on freedoms. Upon his removal, Makayla once again became an outspoken critic from the outside, lamenting that impunity still reigned in Chad. Indeed, the story of Ali's crime and escape had, by 2024, become emblematic of Chad's enduring challenges. Civil society activists would reference it when discussing the country's lack of rule of law. The name came to symbolize both the plight of women and the persistence of elite privilege. Women's rights groups quietly pointed to Éché's ordeal as a rallying cry against forced marriage and domestic violence. How many other Échés were out there in Chad, they wondered. Women whose suffering never made the news because their families didn't or couldn't help them escape. Éché's case was exceptional in that she fought back through legal channels, and even then, look at the outcome. The concept of diya also entered the conversation. After Ali's escape, as the dust settled, an attempt was made to reconcile the matter the traditional way. Representatives from Ali's family reached out to the Goukounis in N'Djamena and floated an offer of diya, literally known as blood money or compensation. This is a customary practice in many parts of the Sahel and Islamic world, where instead of, or in parallel to formal justice, a perpetrator's family compensates the victim's family with money or goods, seeking forgiveness and closure. Accepting a diya can lead to the victim's family pardoning the killer, often resulting in a commuted sentence or dropped charges. But in this case, any such negotiation was far too late. The Goukounis, led by Éché's staunch position, categorically refused the offer. No sum of money could wash away what was done, they insisted. Éché, speaking from exile, was firm. She would not trade her brother's memory for cash, nor forgo the pursuit of justice in exchange for a payoff. The very suggestion was offensive to her, given all she had fought for. It signaled that the family sought justice in the courts and through the law, not through behind-the-scenes deals. And so, time marches on. As of this telling, more than 6 years have passed since that fateful day in N'Djamena. The scar on Idris Goukouni's leg has long healed, but he will always walk with a limp. The Goukouni family home in Facha will forever feel the absence of young Ousmane, whose bright smile is now only captured in fading photographs. Éché remains in France, a survivor haunted by what happened yet determined to provide a good life for her son. Every night she checks that the doors are locked, and every morning she steels herself with the knowledge that she must carry on despite the shadow that still looms. As for Ali, he is a convicted murderer and simultaneously a free man. In the odd paradox that can exist in places where power trumps justice, Ali walks somewhere under the Chadian sun, not having served even 2 full years of his 30-year sentence. Unconfirmed reports place him in or around N'Djamena, perhaps even moving with a sense of impunity, under the tacit protection of those who engineered his escape. The Chadian government has never publicly acknowledged his whereabouts. Officially, he is a fugitive. Practically, he seems untouchable. No officers have been punished for his escape, no inquiry opened that anyone knows of. It is as if the chapter was closed in a way more cynical and dark than anyone anticipated. Not through resolution, but through willful neglect. The story of Éché and the murder of her brother is a story of personal tragedy, but it is also a window into the soul of a nation. It lays bare the fault lines in Chadian society, the power of tradition over women's lives, and the power of the elite over the law. Éché's forced marriage, her harrowing escape, and the violence that ensued show the price women pay in a patriarchal system when they assert control over their own lives. Yet, despite all the setbacks, Éché's spirit has not broken. Those close to her describe her as quiet but resolute. She continues to work with her lawyers and with journalists like Thomas Dietrich to pressure authorities both in Chad and internationally. Éché's journey is not over. In a sense, she is still running, not in hiding as she once was, but running a gauntlet between past trauma and an uncertain future. She has made it out of Chad, but she has not escaped the shadow of Ali